Hello and welcome back to Christian Curious, a series within Cylinder Radio, which is all about critical thinking. And this is addressing questions that people have about the Christian faith. I took a very odd journey through critical thinking and logical reasoning and apologetics and consuming a lot of atheist stuff to arrive at the point of having deep faith, getting baptized and everything like that. And I think that those are my people, the people that say they're too logical to have faith. Those are my people. So let's just get curious. I talk about curiosity. I'm a Socrates person. I love that. You know, Einstein talks about the power of curiosity. And I think that if you want to understand something better, then you just have to tap into that curiosity. So we're here answering a bunch of questions. I have Pastor Billy Calderwood, who's been a pastor for over 30 years. He was a very important part. You were a very important part in bringing me to faith because you were just open to hearing all my questions and you had to, wrestle with them yourself. It was quite a process. So to be doing this alongside you and going when we talk at churches and things, it's really like a full circle thing. It's pretty rad. So our question today is about marriage, and we can take this specific one, but also kind of expand it to the idea of marriage in general through a Christian lens. And this is from Danielle. So here we go.
Okay, so what exactly constitutes a marriage? What does it say in the Bible? If a father was to give his daughter and the man his blessings for them to join in union, do we have to follow ceremonial things like having a wedding, having a wedding party, a reception? What really constitutes the union of a man and a woman being husband and wife under the eyes of God? Is it enough for the man or for the father of the woman to give his blessings for them to be in union? What do you think?
That's a great question. This idea of like what is considered, we know what a marriage is considered by the state. A marriage certificate, and you go to this courthouse, or you go and have a big ceremony at a church, or you go to the beach, and that's what constitutes a marriage. But what about in the Christian lens of what constitutes a marriage? Do you have to get the state involved, or does it just have to be a covenant that you make under God, and just the two of you together with maybe a witness or maybe no witness? Like what does the Bible say about this issue of marriage? It's interesting.
Yeah. Before we even jump into this, I just want to acknowledge people are asking these questions from all kinds of angles of personal experience.
Yeah.
And so the reality of where am I at in my relationship with this person, and I'm committed to them, and maybe they have slightly different ideas about this, or whatever kinds of different things are going on. This is real people's lives that are asking these kind of questions. The other thing I will say is it's become commonplace in the Christian church and in different sects and sectors of Christianity for people to kind of thump on their Bible and say, well, the biblical view of marriage is this.
Yeah.
And that is a challenging thing to do, because if you look through the entire corpus of biblical text, First Testament, New Testament, and you read that whole thing, you're going to find ideas about marriage that most Christians today would absolutely reject. Mm-hmm. So Solomon has, 1,000 wives. Polygamy is widely practiced by the heroes of the faith like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And there's things that are practiced by the patriarchs that later biblical writers actually prohibit later on. So the biblical target, what is a biblical marriage, is a moving target throughout the First Testament. And Jesus says a few things about marriage that seem to narrow the lens a little bit. And then the other big writer about marriage, the main things that we have are in kind of First Corinthians with the Apostle Paul, and then also in the book of Ephesians with the Apostle Paul. If I were to speak on what most Christians believe today about marriage, I would say that most of the church's teaching about marriage today tends to privilege, out of all of that text, they tend to privilege Ephesians chapter 5 and then the teachings of Jesus about marriage. And most ways that people advocate a theology for marriage kind of land on those two things. Within the question, there was a sense of, is it enough that, a father gives his blessing and all of those things? Generally speaking, the history of the church and the biblical text itself really advocate this is a covenant between a man and a woman and God. So whether or not a father gives the daughter to a person, is this the daughter's choice, right? And arranged marriages and fathers basically accepting a bride price and then giving their daughter to a man is very common in the ancient Near East, very much a part of some of the marriage stories we have in the Old Testament. But there's a real pivot in early Christianity towards the willingness of both parties. And that's why it became very important in the church, even in the first few hundred years of the church. Is this woman being coerced? Is this really what she wants? Is this her desire and her will? And if it's not, we should not be blessing this. And so I think the general theology of marriage that most Christians would agree with is this is a covenant between a man and a woman before God to say we're going to commit to one another, we're committing our lives to one another, we're loving one another, and we're doing this before God and witnesses. Now, how that happens is now the modern sort of wedding economy has gotten absolutely out of control. People are impoverishing themselves. Yeah. I'm like, get El Pollo Loco and get married in my backyard. When I was a pastor, I used to tell people, don't get in debt. If you want to make a commitment, invite some close friends and family, make your commitment before God that you're going to love one another well, and let's celebrate on the cheap and take all that money that you otherwise would have spent and build a life. Yes. God's way less cares about what your ceremony looks like than he wants you to have a flourishing marriage where you're committed to one another.
Absolutely. Just in that idea of marriage, and, that gets into the idea of premarital sex and, living together out of wedlock and things like that. I think that, again, you want to aim for the ideal. What is the ideal? What would you want for your children? I think is a good way to look about it, because we are God's children. I would want my boys to meet a girl, say, this is the great one. She's great. So they're in love. They get married. Then they, move in together. They have a family. They build a family together. And I'm cool with them doing that at a young age. As someone who has sowed their wild oats, so to speak, I know how kind of empty that can be. And I wouldn't wish that for my kid. And I think the idea that you need to do that, you need to go out, and you need to experience all of these people, I don't think that that's necessarily true. But you do want to get as close to the ideal as possible, and there are dangers to sex out of wedlock. There are the potential dangers. What I mean by dangers is the exit is there, and part of the covenant that you make under God. If I'm in the middle of a fast right now, 3 days into a fast, and part of the reason why I'm able to get through it pretty easily is because I made a vow to God. I said, you know what, I'm gonna fast. I'm gonna fast and pray a lot this week because there's stuff going on in my life. So I'm gonna do that, and I'm not gonna break. If I make an oath to God, I'm not gonna break it. Mm-hmm. So if you make that covenant with to your spouse under God, you're not gonna break it. So you're gonna find a way to work it out. And that's what marriage is supposed to be. That's why Jesus did talk about divorce quite a bit, because you want to do everything you can to avoid that, because that will, the agreement that you make is that we will figure this out and we're going to work toward peace. And if you find yourself missing your spouse, then you aim at him, and then you end up coming closer and closer together as you move toward him. And I think that's aiming for the ideal would be, if you think about what is the perfect life that you'd want for your child, it would be something along the lines of a more traditional, more quote unquote conservative kind of route of they meet someone, they wait to have a baby until they get married and they have a nice home, blah, blah, blah. You want to aim for that. So the best you can get to that, the better. But then another element of this that gets a little tricky is, what if your partner is unequally yoked? So what that means is the yoke was the kind of thing that they put on cows that they would pull like a plow or something like that. So it was like the weight that you put on your shoulders. And Jesus would talk about, put on my yoke because it's light, and you do take in Jesus, then you don't have to feel the weight of the world. So unequally yoked just means that your spouse is not as much of a believer or not a believer, and you are. That can be an issue as well with people who are going through difficulties with marriage, that they would say, should I marry this person because I'm more of a believer and they're not, or should I marry this person who is a believer even though I'm not? And I think that could be kind of encapsulated in this question as well. What are your thoughts on that one?
I think I've heard questions like this before. I've been a pastor for 30 years, and I've walked a lot of life lot of journeys. I know a lot of people that come kind of and ask this question are people, one of the person comes to faith and they start caring a lot about what does the Bible say about this? But when they look at their life, they're like, we have multiple kids together. We've never been married. We've been committed to each other. I'm not sure that my spouse really cares about, do we really have to do the thing with the paper? And so, do we need to go, is our marriage valid in the eyes of God, even if we haven't gone down to the courthouse and signed paperwork, right? I think the normative thing to do is if a society and a culture says you publicly state your marriage, go to the courthouse, do the thing. But generally speaking, I think some of those kinds of questions are born out of tension because maybe I've been in this relationship for a long time and I'm coming to believe something different about it. And I would like a certain kind of a commitment, and I would like, for us to be public with our commitment to one another, and I'm not sure that my spouse agrees. And so that can be a really painful and a really difficult thing. And the scriptures, in 1 Corinthians do talk an awful lot about if you find yourself in a marriage to a person where you've come to faith, but they have not come to faith, there's all of these great instructions about live at peace.
Yeah.
Do your best in your marriage, even if they have a different vision of it than you do, because your behavior may actually very much influence that person towards faith. If they decide that you being a Christian is a deal breaker for them and they decide to go, you may be forced to you got to let them go. But generally speaking, I think the scriptures offer a lot of hope to someone who finds themselves more pursuing God and wanting a biblical marriage in their life, even though that spouse or that person that they're partnered with in life is like, I don't know that I necessarily see that eye to eye. And so I think there's a lot of hope there. I would encourage you to talk to someone about your particular situation if you're walking through something like that and say, hey, listen, I want God's blessing of my relationship. I do care about the ideal. And, when you talked about the ideal, I think the best biblical standard for the ideal is in Ephesians 5, where it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I'm speaking to you about a great mystery. It's not just about a man and a woman. It's about Christ and the church. That the highest ideal in Christian marriage is I lay down my life for my wife, and she organizes and sets aside some of her preferences for my flourishing. I lay down my life and my preferences for her flourishing. That's two people doing their best to act like Jesus. Jesus lays down his life for the church. Husbands, lay down your life. Jesus submits to the Father's will. Wives, submit to your husbands. And in both of those ways, we act like Jesus, and in both of those ways, we submit to one another. And both two people committed to becoming as Christ-like as possible does something extraordinary. It shows the world it's like a little mini stage play. The way my wife and I interact with one another, the way we love one another, it's bigger than just us. It's bigger than Billy and Kristen. That's about how Christ loves the church. So a biblical marriage done right is one where people act like Jesus in their relationship towards one another, a committed covenantal relationship with one another that shows the world in a little microcosm of your own life, this is what the love of God looks like. It's sacrificial. It lays down itself for the flourishing of the other person. And it becomes a little place where people can get a taste of heaven. So I wish that for the person that asked this question, and for anybody that's watching that wants to be in a marriage. And I think that is the ideal, and that's what God's hope is for every marriage, is that people would be growing to become more like Jesus and more sacrificial in their love for one another, and that people in your life that look at your marriage would say, "Oh, I got a little taste of heaven. The way that these people love one another and treat one another, that's what God is like."
I love that. Yeah, really well put. So thank you, Danielle, for the question. Hope this gives you a little bit of a starting point to dive in more, and to the people out there, give you some things to think about. I thought it was a great point that you made just real quick, where you said, wives, submit to your husbands as Jesus submitted to the Holy Spirit and to God's will, and people might say like, "Oh, that sounds terrible. Like women have to," but then it's like, men, give up your life. So both have to give up something in a marriage, and that's really important. And that's I think good. Yeah. Just secular marriage advice too is you give up something for your spouse. So.
A quick note on that whole thing. Yeah. Paul says, the husband is the head of the wife as Christ loved the church. Well, that was not shocking to anyone.
Right.
If, as a matter of fact, Paul takes headship and turns it on its head. He literally says, okay, you want to know what a marriage is like? Marriage is not defined by asking the question, who's in charge?
Right.
A good marriage is defined by asking the question, who's becoming most like Jesus, and how are we becoming more like Jesus? So I believe Paul's vision for marriage is actually highly egalitarian, but it's also highly cruciform. We become like Christ, and that's what makes a good marriage work. But generally, today in our society, we are consumed with issues of power.
Yeah.
Does she have to submit to me? Do I have to? Who's in charge in this marriage? And the question, the way the Bible answers that question is Jesus is in charge.
Yeah.
And the more you become like him and submit to one another in that process, in a self-sacrificial way, a way of giving your will, giving your preference for the other person, guided by the Holy Spirit, you're going to find your way.
There you go. Yeah, that's the competition. Who's going to be more like Jesus in this relationship?
Yeah.
Love it. Thank you guys so much for listening. Check out patterdocs.com/curious for my free webinar and a whole bunch of other resources that I can send you. Or you can always email me at patterdocs@gmail.com with any questions that you have. Stay Christian curious. I've been in faith for a couple of years. You've been in faith your entire life, and you're going to stay curious to understand God better. So do not pull away. You can ask the questions. This is a really important process in finding truth, is to be able to ask questions. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next episode.